Well, for folks who aren't able to be here tonight, okie dokie. So kind of gonna give a brief overview of what's been going on in this area. For some of our volunteers who wear multiple different hats, this may be a bit of a refresher. Maybe this is something you're like, oh, well, I know about that, been around the block with that one, or have some personal experience there. And we'll have some time to kind of have some discussions, maybe some clarifying questions on how you can best use this information to help answer more specific questions from your alumni Panhellenic officers. And then kind of hopefully Donna will be able to pop in later, and we can kind of talk a little bit about what this might look like on a different scale for our alumni Panhellenic officers. So some changes to recruitment and the impact of COVID. So back about a year ago now, we formed the first task force that was COVID-19 related, which was the Disruption to Panhellenic Operations Task Force. This was a small group. They mainly focused on what kind of accommodations we would need to be making for our college Panhellenics, our alumni Panhellenics, our groups, when what we thought this was going to be was several week break from school. It was in March, so we're like, our college Panhellenics will need to be doing their bylaws during this time. Can they operate virtually? Can our alumni Panhellenics operate virtually? So at this point in time, it was really quickly, how can we make some short provisos in our unanimous agreements and our policies and our best practices, and how can we coach college Panhellenics and alumni Panhellenics and our member organizations to operate in a little bit of a more virtual world. From that task force came the Recruitment Contingencies Task Force. One of the direct kind of items was we need a different group of people and a more intensive group of people to talk about recruitment. Because at the end of that work, there was a realization that we would not be done. Everything would not all be well and fine. And there were a couple of, some forward thinking in that process to say, maybe we should start thinking about the fall. Because while it's March, April, everything seems fine now, there is quite the possibility that we will not be completely normal in the fall. So let's start thinking about what some contingencies might look like. So we formed the Recruitment Contingencies Task Force, and that was a group of about 20 women from fraternity and sorority advisors, member organization volunteers, subject matter experts, staff, chief Panhellenic officers, delegates. There was an ED. It was all over the place, some RFM specialists, and we really talked about what that would look like. So as I mentioned, the Disruption to Panhellenic Operations Task Force. So March 31st report, really, really quick. They had about 2 weeks, and they did all of that work. Sorry, I'm moving around, kind of jumping a bit. But the Recruitment Contingencies Task Force formed on April 8th, and we made our initial report to the board of directors on May 1st. From that initial report, we continued to meet. At one point, we were meeting weekly, and then meeting every other week. There were several small groups that were formed as a result of that focused on various different kind of possibilities, which you can see in the recruitment structure decision flow chart that was unfortunately painstakingly made over the series of several weeks. So we asked college Panhellenics to think if their classes will be virtual or held on campus at any point in time. Yes, no. If no, they needed to consider virtual. They needed to plan for that, because if they're not on campus, there's no way they can have an in-person recruitment. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And we did see from some California schools that they didn't return to campus at all in the fall, and they came back in the spring. So this was some planning that needed to be done. And then if they are returning in the fall, what would that look like? Are there health and safety considerations that you're going to have at play? And at first this was yes, no. We left the no as kind of as an option, but several months down into the process, we realized that there was no way we would have any of our college Panhellenics putting no, as they have no health and safety considerations. Even for our college Panhellenics that were very small and did execute an in-person recruitment, they still had to do smaller groupings of people. They had to do sanitizations in between every single round. Some of them did temperature checks, that kind of process. We shared this with College Panhellenics on May 11th. After the board of directors had it, we had some discussions with council of delegates on potential legislative changes that would need to be made, and there were several that were recommended, and some of those policies actually still exist today, and did not have a proviso expiring on them because of the pandemic. There's something that came out of it that we're hoping will stick around, because a lot of our College Panhellenics saw some success from it, but we're also some of the member organizations really thought that it was a good move. We continued to meet up until I think one of our last meetings was in early September, late August, to produce materials, to continue having conversations about what some folks were hearing from campuses. We had a number of College Panhellenic area advisors serve on these committees, serve on this task force, and in subcommittees. So they would report back on what they were hearing, as well as some of our fraternity and sorority advisors who served. Some of the priorities. So the initial kind of charge of this task force was that a priority needed to be that we adapt and change to survive. The most important thing was that we have some type of recruitment and that we have some type of membership intake this year, because there was no end in sight. And if our organizations did not recruit, if recruitment was completely canceled, that could be catastrophic to some of our chapters on some of our campuses. And the member organizations recognized that. The next thing was marketing the sorority experience, and it needed to be different. It needed to be improved. People needed to get creative. For a lot of our campuses that weren't marketing recruitment beforehand and just relying on women who are always joiners who are going to show up, go through recruitment, they needed to have some type of marketing that would get women to be interested in recruitment, and also know that even if their experience is virtual, their sorority life is still an option for them. And then growth and membership. So this kind of goes back to the promotion of the sorority experience policy that I think we've touched on a little bit sometimes in our meetings, but if not, I'll talk about a little bit later. But how can we allow the most runway for opportunities for growth? And it may not be that we have a parity in numbers, but we may have a parity in opportunities. So while we do need to adapt and change to survive, member organizations did also recognize with this past year, and with some of the policy decisions that were made and proposed, that there were some chapters that were going to close because it just wasn't possible for the community to succeed. So kind of talking a little bit about some of the results from the task force, that would be the virtual, hybrid, and in-person scenarios. So once the recommendations came out in the early summer, we recommended that they plan for contingencies, beginning with in-person, then hybrid, and then virtual recruitment. For some of our larger College Panhellenics, we said, we don't want you to even think about in-person. That's not happening for you. You're doing virtual recruitment. You have you have 2,000 P&Ms in your open house pool, Alabama. You're not doing in-person recruitment. It's just not happening for you. And we need to have a moment to recognize that. A lot of the struggles from this task force were that College Panhellenics, volunteers who work with the chapters, fraternity and sorority advisors, potential new members were very, very hesitant to latch on to virtual recruitment because they did not believe that we would still be in this situation in the fall. So they continued to plan for in-person recruitment or hybrid recruitment. And there got to be a point where we were calling some campuses and saying, you need to do virtual recruitment. The case numbers in your area are this. The member organizations really would like you to do this, and they don't want to do in-person recruitment because it's not safe. So this is what we need to do in order to keep everyone safe, to actually host recruitment and not get shut down by the campus, because that was a big fear as well. But also, it was also a reputational risk, is if we have in-person recruitment on some of our big campuses and there's increased positivity in the area, if people get sick, if God forbid someone dies, Like, this cannot be because of Panhellenic recruitment. This is something that sorority life is essential, but it is not that essential. So we want to make sure that we are still having an experience as safely as possible. This was accomplished through the use of recruitment response teams. So this was formalized in this way, but it was really the area advisor for that campus, the RFM specialist from the previous year, and the fraternity and sorority advisor, and a assortment of college Panhellenic officers. At minimum, we had suggested it be the president and the officer in charge of recruitment. Some people added more, some people switched off officers. It wasn't a requirement from us that they be a certain officer, but there did need to be student voice involved in that process, because at the end of the day, we needed their buy-in and for them to be a part of the conversations that are happening about their recruitment, because otherwise it would be that much more of a challenge to pivot to in-person recruitment if they're not a part of the discussions. So that is kind of how that had gone. Yes, okay, I'm just trying to make sure there's not a bunch of questions going on in the chat. I also hope the promotion of the sorority experience policy sticks around because I think it gets rid of all of the kind of the silly that our college Panhellenic women have created for themselves of, if you're not a blood relative of XYZ, you can't be seen at brunch with her, whatever it might be. It gets out of hand, and our college Panhellenics get in a policing mindset, which gets them out of the growth mindset and gets them out of trying to make better women and better leaders. And so they kind of get themselves all up in tangles. So definitely agree and want to hopefully move past that. So our fall campuses got recruitment response teams formally assigned to them. Our spring campuses did not formally get a recruitment response team. And that was in part due to the fact that there were already a multitude of resources developed for them to utilize in their recruitment process and recruitment planning. They also had the use of their area advisor to plan and utilize, but the strain on the RFM team was a lot, especially if we were going to ask them to repeat and do that again when that wasn't necessarily an expectation we had laid out for them previously. So there was that change from the fall to the spring, but that is what kind of went on there. The next thing I'm going to touch on, which I think is really important just to highlight as it relates to that, is the different recruitment styles. So if you saw on this past screen, it says virtual fully structured recruitment, virtually partially structured recruitment, and virtual continuous recruitment. And this is where we got a lot of questions from a lot of different folks throughout the past year. We have been, the past couple of years, been trying to push more education about partially structured recruitment and continuous recruitment, especially to our campuses that would benefit from this model, who are maybe using a fully structured recruitment and it's not working out for them anymore. They're seeing less women sign up for recruitment, but the interest is still there, or they are having issues with retention in the process because it's too much of an obligation. A lot of campuses who maybe have potentially members who work another job to pay for dues, or maybe just the interest isn't there at the beginning of the semester and they need something that's a little bit more spread out. So kind of wanted to quickly go over the 3 different recruitment styles as recommended. We did used to have 4. We recently-ish in the past couple of years dropped one of them, which was minimally structured recruitment. There wasn't that much of a difference between partially structured and continuous recruitment. So if you see that change there, that is why there's only 3 now. The one thing I always like to point out is that continuous recruitment is not synonymous with continuous open bidding. Some people call it COR. I think that's an ADPI term. Sarah's nodding her head. Yes, okay. But continuous open bidding, or COR, is the process that precedes a primary recruitment process, and continuous recruitment is the primary method of recruitment. So some campuses have no structure in their recruitment process. Brenau is one of our more known continuous recruitment campuses. That's the example I always use. And instead of just having a structure in their process. Partially, there's a ton of educational resources that I can link out once we're done here this evening if you want to do a deep dive and learn more about PSR and CR as recruitment styles, but wanted to also highlight those as well. We have been, in the past year since that has happened, we have also been encouraging other campuses to check out continuous recruitment or partially structured recruitment. A number of campuses in the midst of this made the decision to either move to continuous recruitment or to move to partially structured recruitment because they anticipated numbers being down or because they anticipated too many challenges with organizing a structured process. And so they switched to either a virtual continuous recruitment or a hybrid continuous recruitment. So I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the challenges and successes that we have seen. And I'd also love to, if we have some time at the end, to get some of you all's feedback with maybe some more direct experience with virtual recruitment, because some of the challenges and successes that you've seen as well. So one of the first challenges is the decline in enrollment and decline in open house pool. We were anticipating declines in enrollment for the past several years. There's a decline in the birth rate at this point in time. So it has been steadily decreasing anyways, but because of the pandemic, there are a number of students who either deferred their enrollment to college for a year or chose not to participate in recruitment because they're waiting for the in-person experience, whatever their decision-making might have been. So we saw some declines there. There's also the challenge of the Abolish Greek Life, or the more specifically the Abolish IFC Panhellenic movement that we've seen on several campuses, and how that has impacted so even campuses where it hasn't been present. Maybe they heard it from their friends, or maybe it's just across the street at a different institution, and how that impacts recruitment registration and recruitment numbers across the board. And then the last challenge is something I think I touched on a little bit earlier, but the change management that was required to refocus energy of collegiate members, and advisors onto a virtual process was a pretty big lift for our volunteers, and trying to get them to plan and say, okay, this isn't going to happen. I need to adjust, and we need to start planning for virtual recruitment. Because there were a number of folks who were just really wanted to have that in-person experience. And I don't blame them, because the in-person experience does have its benefits. The next thing is that we saw as successes. We did see increased retention from 81 to 84.3% this far. This is only fall 2020 numbers. This is not the full spring 2021 because we do not have all of those in. We're getting close, but hopefully we will have that number, and I will let RFM Committee Chairman Julie Johnson share those final results, as that is her baby. But we have seen some initial kind of success in that area. There is also the thought process that, not to burst our own success bubble, but that we have a higher concentration of always joiners who are participating in the virtual process. And it's not as many never joiners or maybe joiners. And so they're more likely to stick through with the process because they signed up for virtual, they signed up for something different. The other success is that we did see potential members report less mental stress and anxiety from a virtual process. There wasn't the tent talk of being outside and the comparison syndrome that they felt with other women. There was more focus on conversations and values-based recruitment. So there wasn't the chatter of not being able to hear yourself think. In a room filled with 100 other people, they were able to focus in and have a conversation one-on-one with someone. They were able to control their surroundings in a Zoom situation, which they found to be beneficial. What did we learn? So quickly also going to kind of touch on this as well. It really emphasized, as I think I also touched on earlier, the different models of recruitment and the different recruitment styles, and how campuses really do need to evaluate every year if what they're doing is working for them. Because we've seen a number of campuses who have maybe needed to move from fully structured recruitment for years, just finally shifting now and seeing some really good results with that so far. The virtual environment can provide lower stress, values-based, and cost-inclusive experience, which is a really big thing that we'll touch on a little bit later. And that the other thing is college Panhellenics should remove as many barriers as possible to joining, and they are able to do this through virtual processes. They can reduce the recruitment budget, they can reduce the recruitment registration fee for PNMs, and if they can utilize COB, they just making sure that they allow for as much flexibility for chapters in a virtual setting, but also allowing for making sure they're not setting up any barriers to a potential new member participating in COB or a chapter participating in COB. So they're not having to do a registration form to do COB. They're not saying you can't start COBing until we set total, which is we're going to take the full 7 days from the start of the year, and then you can go. We saw that this past spring with total being set so high. We saw a number of campuses say, no, we want to control this because that has historically been our role, that we now are experiencing some discomfort with not being able to kind of control the pipeline when that isn't really what our member organizations want, and that's not really what NPC wants our college Panhellenics to be doing. Touching on this a little bit earlier, they should reconsider how they're marketing the sorority experience, actually marketing it all for some of our college Panhellenics. That was a big shift for some folks. The recruitment registration fee, not fee, the process sometimes needing to be a little bit more robust to collect more detailed information. For some of our campuses, some did a completely virtual first round of recruitment. And so they did not have any interaction with the chapter to the potential new member. And so the potential new member either uploaded a video or uploaded an essay, and then they watched videos from the chapter. We've heard a lot of mixed reviews on that. A lot of chapters really enjoyed it because it was super easy to get through, not a lot of work, one and done. A lot of potential members despised it because they felt like they were being completely judged off of their application. They didn't get a chance to talk to anyone. They didn't even get the chance to see if they liked it. So mixed reviews there. We're not necessarily recommending that be a move forward for all of our campuses. For folks for chapters and for potentially members who did like it, then that could be something that they move forward with. But also, if they're going to continue in a virtual environment, how can they make the application more robust, but also not make it be a college application? It doesn't need to be redoing that process. They don't need to write 500 words or less about a dramatic life event. It just maybe a little bit more information that they don't have time to talk about in the 30-minute round of recruitment. The role of the recruitment counselor. This past year, we saw a lot of turmoil with that process for a lot of women who signed up to be one thing and then completely got their role shifted around. No longer are they sitting outside of a chapter facility and doing attendance. Now they're maybe doing attendance in the waiting room, but maybe not, depending on the campus, but still providing that emotional support to potential new members is really the kind of the thing that we have emphasized, and that contact should begin as early as possible. College Panhellenics needing to modify recruitment rules and governing documents to create more accessible, equitable, and virtual experiences. We'll talk about this a little bit later about what we see next going on. And then how can we continue to focus on values-based recruitment as a result of virtual recruitment? We're really trying to keep our college Panhellenics in this mindset of, this was great, we created a more accessible experience, this was more values-based. Now, how do we keep this momentum and not just slide back into what we've been doing? How do we keep our eye on the ball? Because this was good, and this is what we were trying to get to. And how do we stay in this mindset? Because I have heard from many fraternity and sorority advisors and many college Panhellenic officers who are trying to get the rest of their community on this wavelength of, we don't just want to go back to normal. We want to continue moving forward. Maybe we're not doing all virtual recruitment, but how do we stay in this mindset where we're focused on this kind of area? Okay. So continuing to remove barriers. So this was a big thing, and I kind of touched on this earlier. We are going to see increased focus on COB over the next several years, likely, depending on what the final total policy is and what's voted and approved in April. We will see more guidance to come, but irregardless, we're hoping to provide some additional guidance to college Panhellenics on how they should approach COB and what their philosophy should be, because we've seen that even with the guidance we've given, they are trying to overmanage the process with good intentions, we think, with good intentions, but not the aims of the process and not what's really best for growth. Some of the other things that have kind of been going on in this realm, a lot of member organization changes that we are anticipating and seeing and have already seen, a lot of legacy policies that have either been modified, removed completely, clarified, that will impact future recruitments, but also more specifically impact how our alumni are messaging about legacy policies. And I think the one thing I emphasize whenever I talk to an alumni Panhellenic officer, whenever I talk to an alumni, is check with your member organization on the most up-to-date policy. If someone has a question about a specific organization, refer them back to the national organization policy, because for some of them, it's chapter specific and XYZ chapter makes XYZ decision about their legacy policy and how far they invite them back. Some it's, we have no legacy policy whatsoever. They receive no special treatment. They maybe get like a special t-shirt on bid day, but that's it, nothing. So it's really important that if they have questions about legacy policies, they refer them back to the international organization. The other thing is letters of recommendation. That's also changing. I think some of our groups are probably changing also who haven't changed already, or maybe in the process of changing that this summer during convention years. Membership practices in general. Maybe that's pre-scoring. Maybe that is how you prepare and plan for recruitment. And then flexibility in recruitment processes. As we deal with some of our abolished Greek life campuses, our member organizations are having to learn how to be nimble and how to change with those campuses and adapt to what the students are saying and what they need in order just to, quite frankly, survive on some of our campuses, but also how to kind of adapt and meet the needs of the current students. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible, but we got a lot of content here and I just could not pare it down, so I apologize. What's next? So that promotion of the sorority experience policy that we had talked about a little bit earlier and kind of alluded to, hopefully keeping that around is the expectation that our groups will be able to freely promote their organizations, that there won't be local restrictions that will keep them from having conversations with people that they're already friends with or people that they know of, or saying being able to say, I'm a member of this organization and you should go through recruitment. Obviously still keeping out the bid promising or the quote unquote dirty rushing aspect of it all, but trying to be more open in how we approach that. We're trying to have an increased focus on equity and access. Making sure that our college Panhellenics are considering if their recruitment is cost prohibitive, how many steps they're taking, and coming out with additional resources, how they can evaluate that and make sure that they are looking at their processes with a lens of equity and access. The third thing is contingencies. I believe that this was shared with Alumnae Panhellenics, and if not, I will try and find this email and forward it to you all. Irregardless, there's some content in this month's newsletter about this, but we have informed college Panhellenics that they need to plan for a virtual contingency first for the fall, and then they can plan for hybrid, and then they can plan for in-person. But they need to plan for virtual first, because we learned our lesson last year, and while we are feeling a little bit more optimistic about what the fall will look like, we have a vaccine, there's an end in sight, but we also have a lot of variants that are happening. And what happens if there are increased variants and the vaccine doesn't cover it. We have a lot of campuses where they won't be able to mandate that students are vaccinated who are returning to campus, and how can we make sure that all of our students feel safe and also not become super spreader events, if you will. The other thing of what's next is if virtual is here to stay. We do have college Panhellenics that have already asked if they can continue having a virtual part of their recruitment process after the pandemic's over and everything's back to normal, because they really liked the efficiency and they liked the cost of the process and how they were able to cut out a lot of things if they had a virtual open house round. The other thing about that, affordability. And then empowering students is really our next part, is making sure that they recognize that they do have the power to change things. We've heard over the past year, a lot of students say, well, that's an NPC policy. It's like, actually, it's not. You can change that. It's in your local bylaws. And we want you to change that. We want you to evaluate your recruitment and try and make it more inclusive and equitable. So I'm going to briefly touch on abolished Greek life and anti-sorority activism. So this past year, we had abolished Greek life movements impact about 34 of our Panhellenic communities, but it really significantly impacted less than 10 campuses. There has been a lot of chatter about it all, a lot of news articles. So I think for sometimes, for me at least, when I look at these numbers, I feel reassured. I'm like, oh, okay, it's not that many. We have about 570 something college Panhellenics. So in the grand scheme of things, it is not impacting that many of our groups. But it did take up a significant amount of staff time and continues to take up our time and our volunteer time as well. The demands are campus specific. So it depends on which campus you're looking at in one moment. Some are more focused on the cost nature of it all, and some are more focused on racial justice and equity. It really depends on the campus and their own priorities. And then kind of the impetus for the movements as well. Some were really sparked, for the most part, most were sparked by a racial incident on the campus, specifically with a member of the fraternity and sorority community, but all have really kicked up steam this summer, more specifically after George Floyd, but really, I think the first big ones that we started having were at the end of June and early July, where a lot of students were disappointed with the lack of response that maybe their organizations had, or the lack of conversations they were having in their chapters around racial injustice. And so their reaction a lot was, we have realized that our organizations are beyond reform and we're going to move to abolish. So it's a mostly social media based campaign. Some have had in-person protests on their campus, but is driven by members, past members, non-members, members of the community who feel they have had harm done because of the Greek system. The impact is really different campus by campus, chapter to chapter. There are sometimes a college Panhellenic where one chapter has lost barely any members and another chapter has lost 80% of its membership. We've had chapters on campuses close, and one chapter is completely fine and the others are just losing members by the day. We are continuing to collaborate with campus-based professionals and member organizations on a case-by-case basis on several campuses, continuing to provide support as they have either if they have a in-person protest, or if they have recommendations that come forward either by their university administration or by a student group, and how they respond to that. We are helping with media statements, helping with response and planning of recruitment. We did have, I believe, all but maybe like 1 or 2 of our campuses who experience AGL fairly significantly complete a recruitment process. More notably, one of our campuses who had a very public experience with AGL this summer, Vanderbilt University, did have a primary recruitment process this spring when they normally do, and actually had a fairly successful one at that as well. So we're continuing to support our campuses who are dealing with these processes. It's mostly been isolated at highly selective private institutions. It has picked up some steam at some public schools as well, but mostly at institutions of similar caliber. We've also seen some it's existed in different variations, so it's not always abolish Greek life. Sometimes it's strip your letters, or we've had kind of like against racism. There's been a different they've called themselves different names, but we have experienced a lot of different kind of variations on that spectrum. Our position is this, and it will probably be unsurprising to you all. Abolishing organizations is a temporary answer to a current issue and will not truly address a lot of campus-wide cultural challenges. There are institutions who have banned Greek life from their campuses and still deal with the misogyny, racism, sexism, homophobia issues that our organizations also deal with. We are striving to create an inclusive and supportive space for all women to join and engage with as their true selves and share their stories. Panhellenic organizations typically provide the only student organized, women's only safe space on campus, and forcing these spaces to no longer exist and shut their doors would be short-sighted. We've seen that at Harvard University over the past several years, and very publicly won that battle lawsuit-wise this past year. And that sororities were founded to serve as sources of empowerment and a community for women who did not have similar support systems on their campus. And so we are trying to reclaim and reestablish our purpose as organizations that create communities of acceptance and mutual support. We have had several media requests and interviews, and by several I mean multiple since June, that speak specifically to the challenges of the Abolish Greek Life movement and our organization's response and thought process behind this. Danny handles all of those interviews. She did an interview with the St. Louis local NPR station as recently as last week. If you have a good news alert on, she spoke specifically about some of the challenges at WashU. If you want to go look at that article, I also have the link if you want me to send it to you. I'm going to kind of read more about what's going on there. Happy to help. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm going to kind of also go through this as well because I do want to be cognizant of time and have some time for questions. We're going to kind of dig into some of the work that we've been doing over the past year as it comes through with diversity, inclusion, access, equity, and reducing barriers to membership. We have some priorities and initiatives that we're focusing on. I'm sorry, there we go. So we believe we have the ability to reduce these barriers to access and membership as a collective. And while our organizations and chapters have the ability to create more inclusive and welcoming environments in individual chapters for women of various backgrounds and experiences. So our priorities and initiatives are focusing a lot on access and equity, as the Panhellenic is really that entrance of the top of the funnel for Panhellenic women. And then I'll touch on affordability as well. So our priorities and initiatives in June, our board of directors of June of 2020, because we're coming up on June of 2021, so got to put the year on that now. Our board of directors put together a framework for our long-term work in this area, and we refer back to this often as well. We recognize that we've fallen short as a community in making our organizations attractive to women from marginalized communities, and that we must change our systems from the inside out. We must also assist our members with collegiate and alumni in becoming active participants in the work and related discussions. So really focusing in on these priorities and making sure that we are continuing to listen and update folks on the work we're doing. So related to that, in August and September of 2020, our COO, Jenny, who I hope all of you have either seen virtually or met, designed and facilitated a listening tour with a variety of different audiences, some of which are included below: fraternity and sorority advisors, college Panhellenic officers, alumni and PC members, and collegiate NPC members, and then collegiate members of the larger FSL community, to hear directly what their experiences related to DEI within the Panhellenic community have been, the changes that they believe we need to make, and the type of resources they believe NPC could offer. We held those sessions listed with the folks there, and the overarching themes that we kind of dragged out of that was that the education and training resources on a broad range of DEI related subjects, including the history of NPC and its member organizations, are needed for all constituencies. Those resources must be developed knowing that our current constituencies have a variety of levels of knowledge and understanding. We need to make sure that we're not just developing resources for the very basic, but also developing some intermediate and some advanced resources as well. The current Panhellenic recruitment process and practices, including all recruitment policies at the NPC and member organization level, need to be redesigned, revisited to make Panhellenic recruitment more accessible and inclusive for all wishing to participate. And that is something that we are having many, many conversations about on a day-to-day basis here. And then NPC and member organization leadership and volunteers should reflect the more diverse members of NPC organizations. There is a desire to be able to hold potential and current members, collegiate and alumni, as well as other member organizations accountable for their actions and inactions in this area. During the past semester, we've engaged in a variety of resource development and kind of the past year as well, that specifically addresses some of those needs outlined in the tour. We are developing a quarterly DEI plan. I'll speak for at least our Panhellenics team, and then we also have some other DEI work as well, and we're focusing on several different projects each quarter of the year that we can complete and share out with alumni and college Panhellenics. So partnering with the Cross-Cultural Fraternal Collaborative to provide implicit bias training for Panhellenic officers and recruitment counselors. That video is on our website, as well as a discussion guide, if you want to take a look at that as well. Implementing an annual DEI plan for staff development, resources, and we are also partnering with the Piazza Center, which that announcement came out a couple of weeks ago, I think, to study cultural competencies within Panhellenic chapters on various types of campuses. And then we're also spending the next year examining costs of membership and recruitment in an effort to make more adjustments that opens the experience up to more women. As a result of those conversations as well, with the board of directors in June and from the listening session, we appointed an access and equity advisory committee in August to consult on these specific topics and make recommendations to the board of directors and ultimately our council of delegates with their meeting in April. They made their recommendation I think at the end of January, and proposed some legislation for the membership meeting in April. They also made some efforts to help diversify the candidate pool for the NPC Board of Directors election, which will also occur in April. But they had they had subcommittees that focused on these three different areas, which was to conduct an audit of unanimous agreements, policies, best practices, and template documents, review norms and practices that have emerged on campuses that create barriers for potential members and members from Black, Indigenous, and people of color and other marginalized identities, and consult with NPC leadership regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion factors that should be considered during NPC volunteer and staff recruitment. The next thing I'm just going to share really quickly is what we are sharing with college Panhellenics about what role they can play in equity and access. Not an inclusive list, of course, but just some ideas that we have started sharing with folks about what they can do, and also as well what our alumni Panhellenics can do. The first thing is officers. So looking at officer structure, if there is maybe not room for a DEI officer, how can roles related to DEI be encompassed into other positions? it has been our stance for a while that there should not be a DEI officer, solely because it's everybody's responsibility, and that it shouldn't just be one person who's in charge of that process. But we are also providing resources for our college Panhellenics in the next week or so, per our quarterly timetable, about if they want to have a DEI officer, what they should consider, and a kind of a sample role description for that officer. The next thing is document review, looking into Panhellenic documents to determine what areas may need adjustments. So for example, from our college Panhellenic model governing templates, we removed all pronouns from documents and refer only to the officer in question. That has been a big topic with college Panhellenic officers in the past couple of years, is pronouns. And then the third is spending time truly auditing recruitment from a DEI lens. So maybe for alumni Panhellenic, that's your programming that you offer and how they're marketing their association and its offerings. Can registration fees come down? Chapters. A big thing we've talked about with college Panhellenics are chapters setting unrealistic expectations with matching attire and decor. How are they putting on a show, and how is that a barrier to access and equity? The fourth, is working with campus resources to provide continued opportunities for education for members. So continuing to educate members about equity and access. And the fifth thing that we have emphasized with our college Panhellenics is knowing how and where to report bias, hate, or harassment incidents on their campus, and educating the Panhellenic on those opportunities, and making sure that they know kind of the pathways, and that members know the pathways to report those incidents. The other projects that I really quickly want to touch on that I think are important are the College Panhellenic Risk Management Task Force. So in addition to that, all of this work that I've already talked about, the board of directors has requested that the staff and a group of NPC volunteers via a task force review and discuss the role of a college Panhellenic. The first work on this topic was centered on the lack of authority currently assigned to college Panhellenics in the realm of risk management. At last year's Council of Delegates meeting, Danny had shared that we had multiple conversations with staff and volunteers about the desire to create and adjudicate risk management policies from the college Panhellenic. And from that conversation, they had directed a group of people to kind of look into what that looks like and see what the options might be. There was a survey that was created. There was a lot of discussions and work that's been done. The task force has regathered, and they will, they're making their recommendations to the Council of Delegates at the April Council of Delegates meeting, and potentially doing some type of pilot with college Panhellenics in terms of risk management policy. The other thing is the college Panhellenic structure and function. They have been related to the risk management discussion. One cannot go without the other, because the reason we have said that college Panhellenics cannot do risk management is multifaceted, but one of that is that it's outside of their structure and their function and their scope. So we have started looking at what it would look like if they were to have that authority, and what how that would affect the structure and function as well. We'll continue to have that conversation throughout the rest of this year, but wanted to include that as well. The last thing one of the last things I want to touch on is advancing the sorority experience. As a part of our work as an advocacy organization, member organizations have asked us to put specific focus and resources on research and marketing to help advance the sorority experience. This past summer, we directed some consumer research aimed at learning more about the relevancy of the women's only experience. And the NPC Foundation helped fund this. We talked with both young women headed to college this fall and their caregivers. And what we learned has informed our current and future marketing efforts. It's also helped us to develop some short-term or quarterly marketing campaign toolkits that we can share with Panhellenic associations and member organization personnel to really focus on our strong points and try and overcome some of the areas of concern, which I think we have had a family meeting about. So I think some of you all might kind of know what I'm talking about. The Her Campus partnership is the other thing I want to quickly talk about. in terms of developing a stronger marketing campaign and meeting potential members where they are. This summer, we launched a partnership with Her Campus Media, which is kind of like a blog site with Instagram takeovers, native articles, which means that we did not write it. It was not sponsored. Someone wrote it and then it was published and pushed out. And other opportunities for current Panhellenic women to share their first-person narratives about their lives and membership experiences. We received nearly 2 million impressions and worked to drive those many college-going women to thesororitylife.com to learn from even more current members. If you haven't checked out TSL lately, I would really encourage you to, and encourage your alumni Panhellenics to push it on their website. I have seen a number of them advertise on their website as I've been kind of snooping around recently, so that's been great to see. And then the Join a Sorority Week was launched this summer as well, and they did another iteration of that in December, which was essentially focusing on some different themes of why join a sorority, what would you get out of it, and then also some personal testimonials as well, some fun gifts, some Instagram stories, some stuff that the youth really seem to like. But that is the conclusion, and I am almost at the hour. So I want to give us some time to have some discussion. I'm sorry for talking so long, but there's just a lot of really good content. I'm going to stop the share. And we can have, if there are any questions, if there's anything you all specifically want to know some more things about, happy to answer those questions.
Well, Jameson, thank you. That was an amazing amount of good information and something that a number of you have been asking for. My apologies, I was like a few others having trouble getting into the meeting in the beginning. So thank you for launching and getting things going. But it's so much good information, but I think, yeah, in individual areas, there still is different questions that come up. So float those to Jameson and she will address them for us so that we feel prepared to talk with our associations with questions that come up. But this was, I think, just a really, really good overview. So thank you for that. And we do just have a couple minutes left, so I don't want to stop anybody from asking other questions. But just reminder to remind your various NPC associations that the annual report is coming up, and the newsletter will just touch on a few reminders in that regard, but that will be the biggest benchmark that is coming up before we have the awards. And so we just want to make sure everybody's looking forward to that. And we're going to look to April 19th for our next team call next month. So we'll get a link out on that. But if you can mark the date, that would be fantastic. So other questions anybody has or pointers you would like to bring up? Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks all for joining. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you found this to be a really helpful update because there's so much going on out there. It's hard to keep up. So
yeah. And if there's anything specific, or if you missed something, maybe in your notes, or you're thinking about it later in the week and you're like, I don't know about that, just let me know. I'm happy to chat through anything that you have questions about.
And great to see you all on here. Carla, great to see you. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.